Welcome back to another eeek whiteboard walkthrough. In this video, we are diving deeper into the details of blood flow through the heart and the lungs, getting really clear on heart anatomy. Fun fact, this video was made because somebody made a request through the website. So if you have topics that I'm not covering that you want covered, go to eeek.com, make a request, and I might just make a video. All right. Let's get into it. So I'm going to start to draw this thorax picture so we can really examine the organs themselves, but I want to keep this little guy on the side, which is to remind you from whole body, this upper portion, upper limbs, thorax, head and neck, other upper limb, all drain into the superior vena cava to get to the heart, whereas everything below diaphragm, lower limb, pelvis, abdomen drains is eventually into the inferior vena cava. Now I say eventually, and I'll add an asterisk. It's true. What I just said is true. If you learn about abdomen, you'll learn about the portal venous system, which is a different system than what we call the caval venous system. And the portal system, before it goes into the IVC, goes through the liver and then dumps into the IVC. So this is still true. But just so you know, there is a slight difference in venous drainage with what's called the portal system, which has to do with digestion, which we'll cover in a different video. So that's our general rule. And now we're going to pull up a thorax. All right, so I've added in a heart. I'm going to add in the lungs on either side, our right and our left lung. But before we do that, I want to cover some anatomy of our great vessels. So we just talked about superior and inferior vena cava, and I want to bring them up here. So the superior and inferior vena cava, as we said, carry deoxygenated blood. So lacking oxygen. That deoxygenated blood is going to enter into the right atria of the heart, which is sort of seen here. What you're actually looking at from the outside is called the right auricle. We're going to open up this atria in a second into the superior vena cava, O negative blood. This is our superior vena cava, SVC. From below the diaphragm up into the same atria, the right atria, is also deoxygenated blood from, instead of the SVC, the IVC going in to the right atria. So this is our right atria. Let me open it up. All right, so we've opened up by reflecting out a window of our atria. If we could see legitimately, what we'd see if we opened it like this is we'd see pectinate muscles, the roughness of the internal aspect of our right atria, and we'd see a smooth portion where the roughness sort of stops or terminates, I like to say, which is called the cristae terminalis. Smooths out right before the valve. So if you can sort of tell, there's a little valve I've drawn in here. I've drawn it in like this with 3 cusps, and these cusps would go actually down into the ventricle below, and we'll see how that happens when I open up that right ventricle. But I want to point out pectinate muscles, cristae terminalis on the internal aspect of the wall. We've opened up that auricle, the right atria essentially. You'll see a shallow indentation that looks like somebody's pressed a thumb into the portion of the atria that sort of butts up against the other atria, and that's going to be called your fossa ovale. So this little guy, fossa ovale, think thumbprint. Then there's another opening. The main reason I opened this up is there is a structure that we will talk about in a different video called the coronary sinus. I drew a little arrow in because the opening of the coronary sinus, which is essentially the vein for your actual heart tissue, the one that all the other veins drain into, is called a sinus. Sometimes veins are called sinuses. So the coronary sinus opens into your right atria. So we also have the coronary sinus here. So this structure, coronary sinus, carries deoxygenated blood because the right atria is only for deoxygenated blood. So if we look at this in a simpler picture, same picture, less structures, we got our heart here, we have our right atria here, and we'll have our inferior vena cava, superior vena cava. as well as opening of our coronary sinus. Valve that is tricuspid, 3 cusps. So this space right here is our right atria. It's got deoxygenated blood from our SVC, our IVC, and our coronary sinus, which is from the heart itself. The muscle tissue of your heart needs blood too, and it needs to drain it as well. And all of these will go through the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is a type of valve. So it has 3 cusps, tricuspid, but it is also a specific type of valve that exists between atrias and ventricles. You'll hear it called the AV valve, which stands for atrioventricular valve. That is the umbrella term for what type of valve this tricuspid valve is. Any valve between an atria and a ventricle is a AV valve. So when we go through tricuspid valve, we enter into right ventricle. This is right atria. This is right ventricle. So blood goes from atria to ventricle through tricuspid valve because you tri before you bi. Bicuspid's on the other side. That's one little fun way to remember that. So we're in the right ventricle. Where and how do we get out? So let me open up this ventricle. This ventricle, for the record, is a lot smaller than your left. Even though I can't really show it from an anterior view, the back side of the heart is mostly left ventricle and left atria. So a lot of front-sided structures are mostly your right stuff, but there is some of our left. But most of the left side is actually kind of on the back, just so you guys are aware. So I've opened up my right ventricle so that we can see it. And the first thing I will see is a very different internal structure. I'm going to see the leaflets or cusps of our valve come down, and I'm going to see them connect to these strings. And then I'm going to see the strings connect to these little hills in our ventricle. And I'm going to see these little hills, and I'm going to see lots of squiggly lines, sort of weird, crazy, looks sort of alien patterns inside this ventricle. We call the texture of the inside of a ventricle trabeculae carnae, like meaty columns. That's literally what it means. The texture of the inside. Think texture. Trabeculae carnae. When I taught that to my students at school, they kept saying carne asada. I'm sorry, but if it helps you remember it, try it. Trabeculae carnae, meaty columns. That's what's in there. And then there's these specific parts that are much more hill-like that exist in here. There should be 3 of them. There might be more, but on average there should be 3. Why? Because the papillary muscles, which I'm going to draw them over here, I'm going to talk about why that one's special. The little hills, that's what a papilla is. Papillary muscles are in ventricles. It'll be in the left one as well. This is in the right ventricle. There are 3. In the left ventricle, there will be 2. And these papillary muscles connect to what people refer to as the heartstrings. And the true name of a heartstring connects to the valve. So they're going to connect to the cusps of our tricuspid valve, like so. So if this is our tricuspid valve, it has these little cusps that connect to these heartstrings, which are called chordae tendineae. So these are the valve cusps, also known as leaflets. Valve cusps or leaflets connect to chordae tendineae that connect to papillary muscles. Because it's a tricuspid valve, we have 3 papillary muscles. Some programs make you learn which one's anterior, septal, all that jazz. The only one I'm going to focus on a little bit so that we have it is this one over here. So this thing over here is connected to, this papillary muscle is connected to the wall. And what wall am I talking about? I'm talking about the wall that exists between my right ventricle and my left ventricle. So this is my interventricular. Inter means between. Septum, separation. So that's my interventricular septum or wall between my 2 ventricles that separates the 2. there is a little bit of trabeculae carne that is very specific and gets a name that connects to one of my papillary muscles on the right side of the heart. And that connection from this papillary muscle to the wall is very important in terms of heart conduction, the nerves of your heart, how it beats. This thing is called, so put a little star in it, the moderator band. It also has a really long name that I'm putting up on the screen now. This is why I call it the moderator band. So our moderator band connects to our papillary muscle that is closest to the septum and is going to help our heart conduction occur in the way it needs to occur to allow this valve to open and blood to go through when it needs to go through and to shut when it needs to shut. So we're going to talk more about this in a different video, but this is our moderator band. It allows for the nerve impulse to get to this papillary muscle at the correct time before it gets to the base of the heart. It moderates the nerve impulse. So moderator band, right ventricle, super important structure. Papillary muscles, chorda tendineae, the cusp of our valve, our interventricular septum, and the texture of the walls that's kind of all over the damn place would be called trabeculae carne. Those are all the important structures of your right ventricle. So what happened to our blood? It's still deoxygenated. It goes through, goes through our tricuspid valve into our right ventricle. From our right ventricle, we can leave. And we leave when it contracts through the pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary means lungs, is going to be a trunk. It's going to start as one vessel, and then it's going to branch off in two different directions. One part of it goes towards the right, one part of it goes towards the left. And then we're going to get to the lungs. Now, one thing I'm going to add, I'm going to erase this. Let's head down here. We have to be able to get out of the ventricle, and we get out of the ventricle through the pulmonary trunk, but there's a valve there too. So a different type of valve. If an atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid valve is one example, separates atria and ventricle, a semilunar valve separates ventricle from great vessel. So our pulmonary trunk and our aorta are great vessels, they're big, and a semilunar valve is the type of valve that separates ventricle from great vessel. In lab, if you cut your pulmonary trunk or your aorta and look inside of it, you will see these great vessels. I'm going to draw one for you. So let's say this is my pulmonary trunk and I sliced it, and what I would actually be able to see is a valve with these really interesting looking cusps. Kind of look like little dishes. I know that looks kind of funky, so let me add some depth. When we talk about the aorta, I'll be able to explain it better. These are like little cups that come together. They look a lot like your tricuspid valve, but they're a semilunar valve, and the same thing that exists in the pulmonary trunk exists in the aorta as well. And they're little cups because essentially when you pump blood out, not all of that blood will make it all the way out of this vessel. Some will fall back down, and so it doesn't pool into your ventricle, it pools in these little cups. And we're going to talk about how when it does that in the aorta, it actually supplies the heart with blood. Very cool. Okay, so first things first, we're going to go through that semilunar valve into our pulmonary trunk. So we are now in the pulmonary trunk, and we are going to go to the right and the left. And those specific portions, when the pulmonary trunk goes like this and goes off in two different directions, this is our right pulmonary artery. And this would be our left pulmonary. This is our pulmonary trunk. We went through our semilunar pulmonary valve, that little valve right here with the cusps. We went through that into the pulmonary trunk. From the pulmonary trunk, we're going to go off to the right, and we're going to go off to the left through what are called pulmonary arteries. And pulmonary means lung, so pulmonary arteries are going to go to the lungs. So I cleaned up our picture a little bit because we've already covered this, and I don't want it to get so busy that we can't follow it. So we are now leaving our right ventricle through semilunar pulmonary valve into pulmonary trunk, going off in two different directions towards the lungs through our pulmonary arteries. So our pulmonary arteries are going to connect to our lungs, and our lungs sit so close to our heart. When you dissect, you have to pull them away from the heart to cut your great vessels to remove the lung because they are sitting quite literally right next to it, and they're on the diaphragm. All right, there's our right lung. Our right lung and our left lung are different. Our right lung is bigger typically than our left lung because the heart is more left-sided, therefore it pushes into the lung. The lung is like a memory foam cushion. It's going to take in and be impressed by things around it. You call those impressions. You sometimes have to identify them in lab. So this is our right lung. What's different about our right lung than our left lung is not only that it's bigger, but that it has 3 lobes, typically. I'm sure you've seen some in lab that are not 3-lobed, 4-lobed, 2-lobed, fused. It's going to look different, but average lung has 3 lobes, 2 fissures. Fissures separate lobes. So we're going to have what's called a horizontal fissure because it's in a horizontal plane, and a oblique fissure because it's in an oblique plane. When you hear the word oblique, think diagonal. That's one way to tell them apart. It's got 2 fissures. It's got 3 lobes. This is our superior, middle, and inferior lobes. What lung? Right lung. What about left lung? Well, it's going to cover up the heart a little bit. We're not going to do it exactly right. It's a little smaller. It's got 1 fissure, and on one of its lobes is a little tongue that licks the heart. That's how I think about it. So we got this tongue called the lingula. Left lung has a lingula, like lingual, like language, tongue. Lingula licks the heart. It's like it was trying to make a middle lobe, never got around to it. So it just has a superior lobe, an inferior lobe, and a little nub called the lingula that licks the heart. And that is the left lung. 2 lobes plus a little lingula. Now, pulmonary arteries are going to go off into both. So there's a right pulmonary artery and there's a left pulmonary artery. And when they get into the lungs, they're going to branch and branch and branch. And I'm not going to go through all of their branches. They're going to tree out. So they're going to go to each lobe, then they're going to go to each segment of each lobe, and it's going to branch. But this blood from our pulmonary arteries is not, and this is very important, pulmonary artery blood is not oxygenated. This is not supplying the lungs, the organ themselves, the tissue of the lungs with blood, because it's not oxygenated. This is going to the lungs' functional units called alveolar sacs or alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. And that is where, when we breathe in oxygen, it goes through our bronchial tree. So there's bronchuses in here from our trachea. I'll add it in because I'm a details person. We breathe in through our trachea. It splits into a right and left bronchus. These are bronchi or main bronchuses carrying air. This is air. This is O2. Comes in and goes to each of these lungs. This also acts like a tree. It's going to branch and branch and branch into smaller and smaller bronchuses carrying air to these alveolar sacs. The end of these bronchi and bronchioles, which is what they get small, is going to be an alveolar sac. And at that alveolar sac, we're going to meet up with deoxygenated blood, and we're going to oxygenate that blood. So our pulmonary arteries, one of the things you can know about them, they travel very close to bronchi. So when you look at them on histology, a bronchi section, which has like smooth muscle and cartilage, that's how we tell them apart, is usually next to an artery. Multiple layers of cells, also has some smooth muscle. You know, your typical histology artery is usually next to a bronchi. They travel near each other because they're going to the same end structure, which is one of those alveolar sacs, where we are going to get way too specific, so I'm not going into it. This is where gas exchange occurs in the lung, at the ends of the tree, essentially. The leaves of the tree, you could say, are your alveolar sacs. And that is where we are going to take the O2 from the air and put it into the blood. But the weird thing is it's not going to be in an artery, it's going to be in a vein, and it's going to be in a pulmonary vein. On histology, you see pulmonary arteries and bronchi next to each other, but you see veins off by themselves. So they're going to be somewhere, let me draw one in, over here by itself in a weird shape, because veins are always weird shapes and thin-walled. And that's actually going to be a pulmonary vein. Off by itself, doing its thing, taking now freshly oxygenated blood into pulmonary veins to take it back to the heart. Back to which side? The left side. So our pulmonary veins I actually made pink here, and I know it's very busy, so let me get rid of this stuff. So pulmonary veins, I made them pink. So what's really going on here is we come in with this deoxygenated blood, negative O2, then it comes back through pulmonary veins with O2 in it. It's going to happen in multiple locations. Negative O2 becomes positive O2. So that just means it's oxygenated now, and it's going to head back to the heart on both sides. So our oxygenated blood headed back to the heart after respiration occurs at the alveolar sacs. We're going to do respiration, and it's going to head back to pulmonary veins. Now I keep saying that and not doing anything, because to see pulmonary veins truly, you have to look at the back side of the heart, the posterior aspect of the heart. So I'm going to draw that for you here. Okay, we're going to do this together. So I've taken this heart, flipped it around. This is the back side, but it has no color on it because I want to say what everything is together from the back side. So this was right side, this was left side. Heart always points its apex, the tip, towards the left, which means this is now left side. So this is left in this lower picture, and this is right. Because we flipped it around, this is the apex. Not all hearts look perfect though. Some of them look like shoes. It's kind of crazy. All right, so if we know that, this is more left-sided, this is more right-sided. This structure I've drawn here is actually your left atria. So I'm going to put LA right there for left atria, which means, and we're going to keep with our color coding, this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing. There's 4 of them. These are our pulmonary veins. They're mainly on the back side of the heart, and pulmonary veins bring blood that has been oxygenated to the left atria from our lungs. So this is from lungs. This would be from the right lung. This would be from the left lung. 4 main veins, pulmonary veins, that are going to go into our left atria on the back side of the heart. This thing right here would be the aorta from the back. I think I arched it the wrong way, but we're going to go with it. That's our aorta. Our pulmonary trunk and our pulmonary arteries can be seen here and here, also going off into the lungs. The superior and inferior vena cava there. And most of what we see on the back side is left atria, left ventricle. I should put this a little bit over. The other structure I want to mention while we're back here, I'm going to fill it in. And this should help you with some of the anatomy, hopefully. When you look at your hearts and you look at the back side, you'll see left atria mostly at the top. Then there'll be sort of a structure going horizontal, and then there'll be the ventricle portion of the heart below. The structure going horizontal is usually the coronary sinus. I mentioned it earlier. It drains into your right atria. Notice it's going towards that area where my right atria would be. My inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, all that jazz. This is our coronary sinus. On the back side of the heart, to orient, I always look for my left atria at the top. Lots of vessels. Coronary sinus between. Ventricles at the bottom, more meaty heart tissue. So, following our blood flow, we have oxygenated our blood in the lungs. It has now come back through pulmonary veins to our left atria. Very difficult to see left atria on this one, but I will label the little portion I put in this picture. So this is LA for left atria. Left atria will go through a valve with its oxygenated blood into our left ventricle, which is a very large, very thick ventricle. So we're going to go through a valve, an AV valve from, and I'm going to draw it here. Here's our left atria with all of its openings to our pulmonary veins, bringing that blood in, which is now arterial blood, oxygenated blood, so let's make it red, into our left atria. Between our left atria and our left ventricle is a valve. But unlike the other AV valve, this is a bicuspid, just 2 leaflets. valves. This is our bicuspid valve. Which type of valve is it? It's an AV valve, atrioventricular valve. This valve separates left atria from very thick-walled left ventricle. In the left ventricle, there are papillary muscles, just 2 this time, that connect to the leaflets through their little chorda tendineae. Very similar structures to our right ventricle. Does not have a moderator band on the left side. That's unique. But it also has that texture inside called trabeculae carinae. It also has chordae tendineae. And it also has papillary muscles. But those papillary muscles, there's only 2 because there's only 2 leaflets of our bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. 2 names for our left-sided AV valve, bicuspid and mitral. Try before you buy, tricuspid on the right side, bicuspid on the left side. So we have our structures. We go from here in our left atria, which basically has no structures you need to know, through our mitral or bicuspid valve into our left ventricle, and this blood is full of oxygen. So we are on the left side in our left ventricle, and we have to leave this ventricle and get to the entire body. Big job. How do we do it? Through our largest artery in the human body, which is our aorta. So we're going to go into the aorta from our left ventricle. I'm going to delete my lingula here, and we got to get to the aorta. Now this is this path from outside the heart covered up. Your pulmonary trunk's in front of it, in front of your aorta, anterior to your aorta, and they're crisscrossing with each other. So you can't really see the base of aorta when you look at the heart from the outside. If you look at it from the top, you can peel them apart and see this. But pulmonary trunk is always cutting across and anterior to aorta, which is behind it. They are crisscrossing. And it's that crisscross at the top of the heart and the pointing to the left that tells me I'm looking at that anterior surface. I probably should have said that ages ago. Anyway, when I want to leave the left ventricle and I'm going to pump really hard, I'm going to leave through what kind of valve? A semilunar valve. And this one I actually want to take a little look-see at so we can see it and talk about the cool thing that the aortic semilunar valve, the cool thing about it, essentially. So when I pump blood out of my left ventricle through my semilunar aortic valve, it'll enter into the aorta. Now we need to do a little bit of aorta talk. All right, so let's talk about our aorta. We just came from our left ventricle. It pumped super hard and shot blood through the semilunar valve at very, very high pressure. So we went through here to the other side and we shot blood through our aorta. And that blood went to many, many places, including down and up, and I'm going to talk about it. Okay, so parts of our aorta. Step 1. Once we go through semilunar valve, there's a very brief portion, about this much, called the ascending aorta. So the part of the aorta that heads up, very small part, is going to be called ascending aorta. The part of the aorta that has branches coming off of it, 3 to be specific, and makes an arc is called the arch of the aorta. The part that then descends and goes behind the heart, so this portion I'm about to talk about is all behind the heart itself. So heart would be here. Part of this aorta goes behind. This portion from here all the way down to the diaphragm is known as 2 things, the thoracic or descending aorta. The 3 main branches off of the arch, you should know, are the right brachiocephalic trunk, brachio-arm cephalic head and neck, right brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, which you know is in your neck, your carotids, and your left subclavian artery. Those are your main 3 off the arch of your aorta. Right brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, left subclavian. Your brachiocephalic is a trunk. It's then going to branch into the right version of these. So you're going to have a right common carotid and a right subclavian artery coming off of your right brachiocephalic trunk. It's just a difference between the two sides. Same basic arteries though. Remember, those are going to go to your upper limbs, your head and neck. They just got arterial blood. Thank you, aorta. Thank you, left side of the heart. The rest of it that goes through the thoracic or descending aorta, there's actually branches off of your aorta at every spinal level that are going off to your actual posterior mediastinum, your actual posterior thoracic wall gets blood from your aorta. If you peel off that parietal pleura on the backside of your thorax, you're going to see these things. They're the arteries, veins, and nerves in the order V-A-N, vein, artery, nerve, that's on your posterior mediastinum. That's getting away from what we're learning today though. Then the thoracic aorta brings arterial blood past the diaphragm into the abdomen, which then splits, goes to the pelvis, goes to the lower limb, all that jazz. So aorta's got a huge, huge job. But let's back it up to here. And I'm going to add something that I think is so cool and is going to set us up for our next video. The heart itself needs blood and it needs arterial blood. And the coolest thing, I kind of touched on it when I was talking about pulmonary valve, about this system to me is that there are little holes. Let's put them here and here in these cusps. All right. And remember when I said when blood gets pumped through here, a lot of it gets out and goes to all the places I just described, but not all. Some of that blood, just via gravity alone, is going to fall back down and be caught in those little cups. And it's going to fill these cusps with blood. But there are little holes in the aorta that connect to some arteries known as your coronary arteries. So the coolest thing to me is that arteries usually require a lot of pressure, a lot of force, but not the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries supply your heart tissue with blood. There's a right coronary artery and a left, I'm just putting CA for time's sake, coronary artery, that actually get blood passively through it pooling in these cusps. And then that blood through our coronary arteries is actually going to supply the heart muscle itself. Then we'll have cardiac veins pick it back up, dump it into that coronary sinus, and put it right back into our right atria to recirculate. So last little cool thing about blood flow is that that's how we actually get blood into our coronary arteries, is through that gravity pull back down. And that is the flow of blood through our heart and our lungs in great detail.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next video. Toodles!